Imagine standing on this snowy mountain, right? And you're looking at the wreckage of a perfectly engineered commercial airliner that just nosedives straight into the rock face.
Just total devastation.
Exactly. And the investigators arrive on the scene. But the airline executives are standing there. And they're saying, well, the pilot checked every single box on the pre-flight manual.
Right. Like, he wore the proper uniform.
Yeah. He drank exactly his 8 ounces of coffee. He spoke, very politely over the intercom. So technically, according to our internal metrics, this was a perfect flight.
It sounds completely insane. I mean, you wouldn't stand there and grade the pilot on a curve while looking at a smoldering crash.
You'd be locked up for saying that.
Yeah.
But according to the source material we are diving into today, that is exactly how human beings have been judging the success of their civilizational systems for centuries. We grade ourselves on the perfection of our rituals, while our societies literally crash and burn.
It's really the ultimate diagnostic blind spot in human history. We obsess over the performance of a routine, and we completely ignore the physics of the actual outcome.
And that is the massive illusion we are tearing into today. Welcome to a deep dive into what is, quite frankly, a masterclass on civilizational survival.
It really is.
For you listening right now, whether you're on a commute, prepping for a debate, or just trying to figure out the mechanics of how human societies rise and fall, we're doing something very specific today. We're taking all religious sentimentality, all the traditional mystical framing that usually surrounds ancient texts.
And we're just throwing it right out the window.
Completely out the window.
Yeah.
Today, we are putting on the hats of master sociologists and systems engineers.
Because that is really the only intellectually honest way to approach the specific arguments laid out in our source material today.
Right.
We are looking at a highly analytical, incredibly dense lecture transcript from the Tului Islam Digital Audio Archives. Specifically, it's lecture 513.
And it's breaking down a foundational text, right? Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 39 through 41.
Exactly. But the lecturer here is not offering, like, a mystical sermon. The source treats these verses as cold, hard laws of political physics.
We are looking at a structural blueprint. Like, how does a society actually survive? How must the power be wielded without just naturally devolving into tyranny?
And what is the ultimate socioeconomic charter of a civilization once it actually, gains power?
Right. So the vibe here is high energy, razor sharp, and entirely rational. Let's just get straight into it. The source opens with this biting critique of how people, specifically believers in this context, evaluate their own success.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't. The lecture points to the massive annual gathering of the Hajj pilgrimage as the prime example of this diagnostic failure.
To critique is just devastatingly mathematical. The text points out that a community will gather millions of people from across the globe. They'll pool these massive logistical resources.
Spend literally billions of dollars.
Right, billions of dollars. And they perform every single physical step of this complex ritual with absolute microscopic perfection. And then they go home feeling utterly satisfied.
Like they've won.
Exactly. They believe they have secured their ultimate salvation simply because the physical mechanics of the ritual were completed.
But wait, isn't that the traditional definition of a religious duty?
Yeah.
If you believe the command is to perform the ritual, and you perform it, why wouldn't you feel satisfied? You followed the manual.
And that is precisely where the lecturer applies the systems test. A system's efficacy cannot be judged merely by the repetition of its processes.
It has to be judged by its real-world output.
Precisely. The text argues that the foundational purpose of this massive global gathering was never supposed to be just a spiritual vacation. It was designed as a mechanism for global socio-political cohesion and defense.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if a community possesses the resources to gather millions of people globally, yet that overarching community remains oppressed, vulnerable, impoverished,
and entirely defenseless against global forces.
right, then the underlying machinery is broken. The ritual has fundamentally failed its actual purpose.
It's exactly like your airplane analogy. The text insists that the foundational text, the Quran, operates on a strict formula of cause and effect. Action X is engineered to produce outcome Y.
And outcome Y is tangible, real-world security, societal strength, and defense against oppression.
Yes. So if outcome Y isn't materializing, then your application of Action X is fatally flawed. The promise of security isn't magical. It is conditional on the system producing a tangible result.
I'm looking at the transcript, and the imagery used here is just striking. The speaker is essentially calling out massive cognitive dissonance. He talks about people crying out for help on the global stage, completely marginalized and defenseless.
While simultaneously patting themselves on the back for circling a building perfectly.
It's exactly like a tech startup, having flawless daily stand-up meetings, checking every box on their agile workflow chart, giving each other high fives in the break room.
While their core software product just keeps crashing and wiping their clients' data.
Exactly. You can't just say, well, we followed the manual. The outcome is the only metric that matters. This completely strips away the comfort of passive piety.
It really does. You can't just sit there relying on sureties of salvation in the afterlife while completely ignoring the immediate worldly responsibility of self-defense.
There's a part of the lecture that brutally mocks this historical mentality, where people just sit around waiting for a magical cavalry, like people waiting for green-turbaned saviors to descend from the clouds to drop bombs on their enemies.
Or waiting for some grand mystical saint to suddenly fix a collapsed economy. The text aggressively dismantles that magical thinking.
It states unequivocally that the help of God does not arrive as an army of angels intervening to save people who refuse to build their own defense systems.
Right. It arrives through human agency. It manifests as firmness of footing, strategic resolve, and systemic organization.
So if the duties of this system are going to be fulfilled in the physical world, they must be executed by human beings taking calculated, organized action. Okay, so if passive rituals don't save a society, and if waiting for magical intervention is a mathematical failure, how does a community actually secure its existence? Because if you're a marginalized group, good intentions aren't going to stop a tank.
Which brings us to arguably the most profound sociopolitical statement in the entire text. We move to verse 22.40.
Right, the physics of power.
Exactly. And what is laid out here is a startling mechanism for the survival of human conscience.
I had to read this specific part of the source notes like 3 times to make sure I was understanding the implications. The text explicitly states that if it were not for the fact that power is repelled by power,
One set of people checking another?
right, then monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, places where God's name is remembered, would have been completely demolished.
Let's extract the theology from that for a moment and look at the underlying sociology. This is a hard law of political physics.
Freedom of conscience, the basic human right to believe and think freely, does not survive because people write beautiful poetry about peace.
No, it does not survive through moral appeals to tyrants. It survives only because power is mechanically balanced against power.
It's basically Newtonian physics applied to geopolitics. For every aggressive, expanding force, there must be an equal and opposite defensive force.
If you remove the defensive force, the structure of human freedom simply collapses. Unchecked dominance by any single faction, no matter what ideological label that faction wears, inevitably ends in tyranny.
Because human nature, when handed absolute unchecked power, will eventually move to wipe out the diversity of thought around it.
Exactly. The balance of power is the mechanical lever that prevents totalitarianism.
But hold on, let's look at the exact phrasing of that verse, because this is where it really defies normal historical logic. The text is outlining a defense system for an emerging 7th century community.
Right.
But it explicitly defends the houses of worship of other communities by name before it mentions its own. It lists monasteries, churches, and synagogues. And then it mentions mosques. Why?
It's a great question.
Doesn't a rising power, especially one with a new ideology, usually want a monopoly?
Yeah.
I mean, the standard historical playbook is tear down the old institutions, only our buildings matter now.
That is the standard playbook of a tribal or imperial power. But the pluralist insight here is what makes this a masterclass in systems engineering.
How so?
The principle being structurally defended isn't tribal loyalty. It isn't a sectarian monopoly on real estate. The principle being defended is freedom of belief itself.
So the overarching concept of universal human conscience is prioritized higher than the specific religious identity of the people currently fighting.
Yes, because a system that allows one creed to raise the institutions of others has already become the exact tyranny it claims to be fighting against.
Wow.
If a movement claims to stand for justice, but the moment it gets power, it uses that power to crush a synagogue or a cloister, it has instantly invalidated its own constitutional premise.
Because it's no longer checking power, it's just becoming the new unchecked power.
Exactly. By placing the defense of others' sacred spaces prior to the defense of its own, the text establishes a universal principle. The right to freedom of conscience supersedes religious nationalism.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It means the civilization being envisioned here isn't just a safe space for one group. It is engineered to be a structural guarantee for everyone's right to think freely.
Protected pluralism isn't just a nice byproduct, it is the engineered result of balancing power.
And if we connect this to the broader reality of how human societies function, it explains why taking physical action is sometimes mathematically necessary.
Right. If a totalitarian force is moving to demolish that pluralism, passive resistance won't save the monasteries. Singing songs won't save the synagogues. Only a counterforce can halt the demolition.
Okay, so power must check power to protect pluralism. But who gets to pull that trigger? Because balancing power can very easily become a convenient excuse for endless preemptive wars.
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
Right. If I just say, well, I need to balance your power, I can justify attacking anyone. Does the text provide a mechanism to prevent this from turning into a blank check for aggression?
It does, and it handles it with incredible linguistic precision. The text moves backward slightly to verse 22.39 to define the exact parameters of when that counterforce is legally activated.
And this is where we get into the linguistic deep dive.
Yes. It uses the Arabic word uthena. The verse states, permission is given uthena to those who are fought because they were wronged.
Let's break down that word uthena. It just means permission, right?
It translates to permission, authorization, or granting a license. But notice what it is not. It is not a generalized, open-ended command to go out and conquer the globe.
It's strictly reactive.
Exactly. It is a remedial measure.
So this uthena acts like an emergency relief valve in a highly pressurized system.
Yeah.
It only opens when the pressure of oppression crosses a very specific, measurable threshold.
Yes.
But what is the threshold? What actually triggers the license to push back?
The trigger is defined in the very next sentence, in verse 22.4. The authorization to resist is granted to people who are expelled from their homes without right, only for saying, "Our Lord is God."
Expelled purely for their beliefs.
Exactly. It is the ultimate defense against ideological displacement. The cause that mathematically and morally justifies organizing a systemic resistance is the reversal of gross injustice and the protection of universal conscience.
It is never for territorial expansion.
Never.
It is never for capturing resources or accumulating wealth. The valve only opens to stop a tyrant from displacing people based on their freedom of thought.
And this part of the source material gets incredibly animated. The lecturer actively mocks the historical narratives that have built up over the century.
Yeah, he goes completely in on this.
Specifically, he attacks the pervasive myth that this system, that Islam as an ideology, was spread by the sword. He doesn't just call it morally offensive, he breaks it down and treats it as a mathematical and sociological absurdity.
Because forced mass conversions do not make any sociological sense.
Yeah.
They also completely violate the explicit textual limits of uthena we just discussed.
Right. You cannot engineer a stable, sustainable socioeconomic system by forcing people at sword point to change their deeply held internal beliefs.
The human mind simply does not function that way. And any system built on that kind of psychological coercion will inevitably fracture.
The lecturer uses this hilarious, highly sarcastic anecdote to prove how ridiculous these exaggerated historical claims are. He targets a specific myth in the Indian subcontinent about a conquering army supposedly cutting down a mond and a quarter of sacred threads from conquered Hindus every single day.
Right, and for context, for you listening, a mond is an old unit of mass used in South Asia, equivalent to roughly 37 kilograms, or about 80 pounds.
Exactly, 80 pounds of sacred threads.
So the lecturer just stops and does the basic logistical math. He says, think about what a sacred thread is. It's a tiny, thin piece of cotton worn across the body.
It weighs practically nothing.
Exactly. How much does one single cotton thread weigh? A fraction of a gram. So to physically accumulate 80 pounds of these threads, you would have to be conquering, killing, or forcibly converting hundreds of thousands of people every single day.
Without fail.
For decades or centuries. He calculates the sheer logistics of that and points out the absurdity. He says, look, within 10 years, you would have run out of human beings in the entire subcontinent.
You would have to start importing populations just to have enough people to cut threads from.
It's so absurd when you actually look at the math.
It's a brilliant application of reductio ad absurdum. By taking the exaggerated historical claim and stretching it to its logical mathematical conclusion, he reveals it as a complete logistical fabrication.
The broader point he is making is crucial, though. The objective of the power dynamic outlined in the Quran was never to force belief.
Because belief, by its very definition in human psychology, requires free intellectual and emotional assent.
And the text itself explicitly states that elsewhere, right? That there is no compulsion in religion. You literally cannot force the heart and the mind to accept a truth by holding a blade to someone's neck.
It just creates hypocrites, not a cohesive society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what is the actual purpose of the sword, or rather, the systemic application of state power?
It is strictly meant to dismantle the tyrannical power structures that are preventing people from thinking freely.
The goal is to clear the arena, to remove the oppressive dictator so that ideas can compete on their own intellectual merit.
When the text talks about helping God's cause, it is not talking about helping a tribal deity win a cosmic football game. It literally translates to helping establish that just, pluralistic socioeconomic order where humans are free.
Okay, so let's follow the timeline here. The emergency valve opens. The oppressed use that uthena, that permission, they apply the counterforce, power checks power.
Right.
And let's say they win. They overthrow the oppressor, the tyrant is removed, and the arena is clear. What happens the day after the revolution?
That is the big question.
Because history is literally littered with marginalized, oppressed people who overthrow a dictator, only to move into the palace and immediately become the new dictators by Tuesday.
That is the great tragedy of human history, the cycle of the oppressed becoming the oppressor. And it is exactly what Section 4 of our outline, the law of requital, addresses.
Which brings us to verse 22.41.
Yes. This verse serves as the ultimate constitutional safeguard against that cyclical tyranny. It is the charter of the empowered.
Verse 22.41 lays out a highly specific job description for the newly empowered. It applies to those who, if we establish them in the land, and the Arabic word used here is Makkahnahum, establish the system, deliver the welfare economy, enjoin good and forbid wrong.
We really need to pause heavily on that word Makkahnahum.
Yeah, let's break that down.
It implies attaining actual statehood, gaining systemic power, establishing a firm jurisdictional footing in a territory. The source argues vehemently that achieving this statehood is an absolute prerequisite for fulfilling the subsequent duties.
You cannot run a global socioeconomic system. You cannot restructure an economy if you are a marginalized group hiding from a hostile government.
Exactly. You can't implement a nationwide universal basic income from your living room. You need the levers of the state. You need infrastructure.
But once you finally have those levers, the text completely redefines what you are supposed to do with them. And this is where the lecturer completely dismantles the traditional, individualistic, ritual-based interpretations of religion.
This is the massive paradigm shift of the lecture. Traditionally, for centuries, people have read the phrase, establish Salat, and assumed it merely means mandating that every citizen performs the physical geometry of prayer 5 times a day.
And they read, give zakat, and think it means dropping a meager 2.5% annual charity donation into a box to help the poor.
Right. But the source says that is a catastrophic reduction of what is actually a massive civilizational charter.
It argues that Salat is not merely the physical act of bowing and prostrating. It is the establishment of a rigorous, equitable socio-political order.
It is an overarching constitutional system where all the moving parts of society operate in harmony, following a central directive of justice.
And similarly, zakat is not a microscopic charitable donation that leaves massive systemic wealth inequalities perfectly intact.
I mean, how does a 2.5% charity fix structural poverty? It doesn't.
It absolutely doesn't. The lecturer defines zakat as the delivery of a comprehensive welfare economy. It is the structural, macroeconomic redistribution of wealth to ensure the physical nourishment, education, and growth of every single individual in that society.
I want to stop and look at the real-world application of this, because historically, haven't we seen massive empires and kings claim they are fulfilling this exact charter?
Oh, constantly.
They build massive, beautiful, billion-dollar mosques. They force all their citizens to attend Friday prayers.
But meanwhile, the wealth is hoarded by a few elites, and citizens are starving in the streets. Weren't those kings technically fulfilling the mandate to establish prayer?
They were fulfilling the illusion of the ritual, which brings us right back to our opening analogy of the crashing airplane.
Ah, right, checking the boxes.
Exactly. The source argues that those rulers have hijacked the terminology. They're performing the theater of piety to mask the reality of their economic oppression.
If a leader builds a magnificent monument but ignores the staggering economic inequality outside its doors, they have completely abandoned the charter of 22.41.
In the system, power is not granted for self-enrichment. It is not granted for monument building or legacy making.
It is granted exclusively for instituting an equitable order and managing the redistribution of resources so that no citizen falls through the cracks.
The source has this brilliant, very relatable anecdote about everyday hypocrisy that illustrates this perfectly.
The merchant story, right?
Yes. It talks about a wealthy merchant in society who performs his prayers, his traditional physical salat, flawlessly. He goes to the mosque, says all the right words in Arabic, bows at the perfect angle.
He even cries during the sermon.
Right, he cries during the sermon. But then he walks out of the mosque, goes straight to his shop, and immediately starts lying about his products, cheating his customers, and engaging in corrupt supply chain practices.
It is a profound behavioral contradiction. He believes he is a righteous person purely because of what he does on a prayer mat, completely ignoring the societal damage he inflicts with his cash register.
Exactly. And the source argues that an actually engineered Salat system, the overarching socioeconomic order envisioned by the text, is designed to make that kind of behavioral contradiction obsolete.
But how? I mean, how does a government system magically make a corrupt merchant honest?
It doesn't use magic. It uses socioeconomic levers. Think about the psychology of corruption. Why does the merchant cheat?
Usually, it is driven by an underlying existential panic. The fear of poverty, the fear of not having enough to survive or provide for his family in a hyper-competitive, cutthroat market.
But if the state has established a true zakat system, a comprehensive welfare economy that guarantees housing, medical care, and basic nourishment for every citizen, that existential panic is removed.
So when the state removes the threat of starvation, the psychological incentive to cheat your neighbor drops drastically.
Precisely. That is systems engineering applied to sociology. You don't just stand at a pulpit and tell people to be good.
You design a macroeconomic environment where being good is the path of least resistance.
You design a system where corruption is not necessary for survival and where it is systemically audited and flushed out by the overarching order of Salat.
Power is treated purely as a trust. The text explicitly concludes this thought by stating, "To God belongs the outcome of affairs."
Which is a huge statement.
What does that actually mean in practical governance terms? To God belongs the outcome.
It means the strong man, the president, the king, and they do not own the system. The system owns the result.
So the ruler is merely a temporary administrator hired to execute the charter.
Yes. If the administrator fails to deliver the equitable order in the welfare economy, they are in breach of contract. They possess no divine right to rule.
Okay, that sets up a massive operational challenge. They have state power, they are establishing order, they're distributing wealth.
Yeah.
But what keeps the system from going stale?
What keeps the administrators from slowly rewriting the rules to benefit themselves over the decades?
Exactly. The final components of the charter in verse 22.41 say, "The empowered must enjoin good amr bil maruf and forbid wrong nahi anil munkar."
And once again, we have to strip away the traditional dogmatic interpretations. The source is very careful to define maruf.
It does not define it as obscure, culturally specific religious dogma that only one tribe understands.
No, it defines maruf as universal, universally acknowledged truths and human rights. Things that human reason and human conscience universally recognize as objectively good. Justice, fairness, physical security, honesty, freedom of speech.
And munkar is the exact opposite. It's that which human reason universally rejects as detrimental to society. Oppression, theft, corruption, exploitation, monopoly.
So the state isn't there to police your private thoughts or force you to wear a certain color. It's there to structurally enforce universal human rights and prevent universal societal harms.
But this raises a critical operational question for any ancient text. How does this system handle new, unprecedented challenges?
Yeah, because the foundational text we were discussing was revealed in the 7th century.
It obviously doesn't contain a specific rule about, say, the ethics of artificial intelligence or modern global trade tariffs or genetic engineering. How does this system adapt to the 21st century without breaking its foundational charter?
I love how the source addresses this. It points to the mechanism of shura, which translates to mutual consultation.
But the lecture emphasizes heavily that this isn't just an ancient king asking his wealthy buddies for advice over dinner before doing whatever he wanted anyway.
No, it is the operational framework of a highly controlled, data-driven democracy. It is institutionalized systemic feedback.
The foundational text provides the unchangeable constitution, the core values of justice, the mandate for welfare, and the protection of pluralism. Those are locked in.
But the day-to-day laws, the specific municipal codes, the applications of those principles to new technological problems, those must be determined dynamically through Shura.
The source gives a truly brilliant historical example of this in action during the early statecraft of the Islamic civilization. It details a major crisis faced by Caliph Umar, the second ruler after the Prophet.
To understand this, we have to look at the geopolitical context.
Right. The Muslim armies had just defeated the Persian Empire and conquered massive new territories in Iraq. It was incredibly fertile, wealthy land.
Now, the standard operating procedure for every empire in history up to that point, whether Roman, Persian, or otherwise, was simple. To the victor go the spoils.
The generals and the soldiers expected that massive territory to be divided up and handed to them as personal estates.
It was the unquestioned economic expectation of conquest in the ancient world. It was how you paid your armies.
Right. And the political pressure on Umar must have been unimaginable. You have a victorious, heavily armed military waiting for their payout.
If you're a standard dictator, you sign the paper, enrich your generals, secure their loyalty, and move on.
But Umar didn't do that. The source notes that he paused. He hits the brakes on the entire empire, like he pauses for an entire month.
A full month, just stress testing the decision against the constitutional charter.
He realized that if he followed the Roman or Persian model and gave all that fertile land to a few military commanders, he would be instantly creating a new feudal aristocracy.
He would be creating the exact massive wealth inequality that the system, the zakat welfare economy, was explicitly designed to prevent.
So for an entire month, he holds intense public, data-driven debates with the Shura, the Consultative Council. He isn't just relying on his gut feeling. He's analyzing the Quran, searching for the underlying macroeconomic principle regarding wealth distribution.
And finally, he finds the guiding principle, brings it back to the council, and argues that the land cannot be privatized by the military.
It must remain in the public trust, managed by the state, to generate agricultural revenue for the welfare of all future generations, not just the soldiers who happened to swing a sword that day.
And crucially, the council debated him and eventually agreed. That is the mechanism of Shura in action.
It illustrates that policy decisions in this empowered civilization must be heavily debated, data-driven, and rooted strictly in the systemic charter of welfare and equity.
Rather than the whims or even the intense immediate political pressures of a ruler. It prevents the rapid accumulation of wealth by an elite class, which is a structural safeguard we are desperately missing in much of modern unchecked capitalism.
The system constantly corrects itself through structured consultation. It's a continuous moral and practical correction loop.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pull all of this together, because the arc we've just tracked is breathtaking when you view it without the baggage of traditional religious history. We've moved from the absolute depths of marginalization and oppression to the heights of sophisticated civilizational design.
If we synthesize the journey from verse 22.39 to 22.41, we are looking at a complete sequential architectural blueprint for a just society.
First, the wronged. Those who are displaced simply for exercising their freedom of conscience are given explicit, remedial permission to resist.
But that resistance is mathematically and morally justified only by the defense of universal conscience.
The valve only opens to protect the monasteries, the churches, the synagogues, just as much as the mosques. It is about utilizing power strictly to protect pluralism from tyranny.
Exactly. But the crucial test, the ultimate exam for any liberation movement or revolution, arrives the exact moment the formerly oppressed gain state power.
The day after they win.
Right. They do not get to seek revenge. They are immediately bound by a strict, unyielding systemic charter.
They must establish the equitable socio-political order of Salat. They must deliver the comprehensive macroeconomic welfare economy of zakat.
They must ensure universal human rights through Maruf, and they must navigate the future through the continuous democratic consultation of Shura.
If they fail to implement this architecture, if they hoard the wealth among their elite, if they crush political dissent, if they use their power to destroy the institutions of other beliefs,
then it does not matter how mathematically valid their original grievance was. It doesn't matter how beautifully they perform their rituals.
they have simply become the next tyranny in the historical cycle. The civilizational lesson is stark. Every revolution is judged entirely by what it institutes the day after it wins.
Power is a trust, and it is tested exclusively by what it builds.
Which brings me to a final thought, something for you listening to really mull over as you go about your day. We've just spent this time breaking down an incredibly precise, mechanically sound system of socioeconomic justice, universal welfare, and structurally protected pluralism.
It's a massive framework.
It is. So if a society actually achieves this perfect balance in the real world, where power rigorously checks power to prevent tyranny, where the economy is built on absolute welfare so no citizen ever falls through the cracks, and where the freedom of conscience is fiercely protected for every single demographic.
Does it actually matter what ideological or religious label that civilization wears on its surface?
That is the ultimate question of systemic efficacy. Is the label the reality, or is the engineered outcome the reality?
Or is the implementation of the system itself the truest realization of the text?
Think about our airplane from the beginning of the deep dive. If the plane flies perfectly, if it navigates the storm safely and gets every passenger to the destination efficiently,
Do you really care what corporate logo is painted on the tail?
the outcome is the proof of the design. The real-world output is the only metric that matters.
Absolutely.
Something to think about. Until next time.